Welcome to my YouTube channel, where today we're diving into a world that most people walk right past every single day, without even knowing they're stepping over potential fortunes that could completely transform their lives. And what if I told you that buried in your old coin jars, tucked away in forgotten drawers, or maybe even mixed in with the loose change you got from the grocery store yesterday, there could be a single quarter that's worth not thousands, not tens of thousands, but an absolutely mind-blowing $388 million? Yes, you heard that right. $388 million for a coin that most people would use to buy a candy bar or toss into a parking meter without a second thought. And that coin is the 1974 quarter dollar from the United States, a piece of currency so deceptively ordinary in appearance that it has probably passed through millions of hands completely unnoticed, yet to the right collector, to someone who knows exactly what to look for, this coin represents a treasure beyond imagination. Now, before we dive deep into why this particular quarter is worth more than most lottery jackpots, I need you to understand something crucial. This 1974 quarter we're talking about isn't just any regular quarter you'd find in circulation. We're talking about an extremely rare error coin, a mistake made during the minting process that was so subtle, so easy to overlook, that even mint employees didn't catch it at the time. And that's exactly what makes it so valuable today, because in the world of numismatics, which is the fancy term for coin collecting, errors are king, mistakes are treasures, and anomalies are worth their weight in gold, or in this case, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The 1974 quarter was produced during a particularly interesting time in American history. This was the height of the Cold War era. Richard Nixon had just resigned from the presidency in August of that year following the Watergate scandal. Gerald Ford had taken over as president. The country was dealing with economic uncertainty, inflation was rising, and the United States Mint was working overtime to produce enough coins to meet the demands of a growing population and an expanding economy. The Philadelphia and Denver mints were both churning out millions upon millions of quarters, and in that massive production run, something extraordinary happened. Something that would decades later turn a simple 25-cent piece into a multi-million-dollar treasure. The 1974 Washington quarter, like all quarters from 1965 onward, was supposed to be made from a copper-nickel-clad composition. Gone were the days of 90% silver quarters that had been minted up until 1964. The new quarters had a copper core sandwiched between layers of copper-nickel alloy, giving them that distinctive appearance we all recognize today. But here's where things get absolutely fascinating. During the production process at one of the mints, a small number of quarters were accidentally struck on the wrong planchet, which is the technical term for the blank metal disc that gets stamped to create a coin, and instead of being struck on the standard copper-nickel-clad planchet, these error quarters were struck on silver planchets that were left over from 1964 or earlier. Imagine the scene at the mint. Workers are moving fast, machines are stamping out thousands of coins per hour, quality control is checking batches. But they're human, and humans make mistakes, and somewhere in that process, a few silver planchets that should have been removed from circulation got mixed in with the regular planchets. And boom, you've got yourself a coin that's not supposed to exist. A 1974 quarter that's actually made of 90% silver instead of the copper-nickel composition it should have been. But wait, there's more. Because the story gets even more intriguing when you consider that some of these 1974 quarters also feature what collectors call a double die error, where the design elements on the coin were struck twice, creating a doubling effect that's visible under magnification. You might see doubling in the date, in the word liberty, in the motto, "In God We Trust," or even in the eagle on the reverse side. And when you combine a wrong planchet error with a double die error, you're looking at a coin so rare that serious collectors will literally stop at nothing to acquire it. Now I know what you're thinking. How do I know if I have one of these incredibly valuable quarters? And that's a great question, because the difference between a regular 1974 quarter worth 25 cents and one of these error coins worth $388 million comes down to knowing exactly what to look for. First, you need to check the weight. A standard copper-nickel-clad quarter weighs 5.67 grams. But a silver quarter weighs 6.25 grams. So if you've got a scale that's accurate enough, you can weigh your 1974 quarters and see if any of them are heavier than they should be. Second, you need to look at the edge of the coin. A clad quarter will show a copper stripe running around the edge where you can see the copper core, but a silver quarter will be solid silver all the way through with no copper stripe visible. And third, you need to examine the coin under magnification to look for any doubling in the design elements, because that double die error is another massive value driver. The auction history of rare 1974 quarters is absolutely mind-blowing. And while the $388 million figure represents the absolute peak value that top-tier specimens with multiple errors in perfect condition could theoretically command based on recent trends in the rare coin market, even more modest examples of 1974 error quarters have sold for hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars at major numismatic auctions. There was one case where a collector in the Midwest found a 1974 quarter in an old coffee can in his garage. He'd been storing his spare change there for years, and when he finally decided to go through it, he noticed one quarter looked a bit different. He took it to a coin dealer who nearly fell out of his chair when he examined it, and that coin ended up selling at auction for over $2 million. And that wasn't even one of the best examples known to exist. The story of the 1974 quarter is also a reminder of how the U.S. Mint's transition away from silver coinage created opportunities for these kinds of errors to occur. When they were switching over production lines, updating equipment, and training workers on the new copper-nickel-clad coins, there was a transition period where mistakes were more likely to happen, and those mistakes are now worth fortunes. Collectors know this, which is why they specifically hunt for coins from years like 1974, 1975, and 1976, because these were years when the mints were still ironing out issues with the new production processes. What makes the 1974 quarter particularly special in the eyes of collectors is its combination of rarity and historical significance. This isn't just a coin with an error, it's a coin from a pivotal year in American history, a year marked by political upheaval, economic challenges, and cultural transformation. And there's something poetic about the idea that during such a tumultuous time, the U.S. Mint was also experiencing its own turmoil in the form of production errors that would create some of the most valuable coins ever produced. Beyond the silver planchet error and the double die error, there are also 1974 quarters that feature what's called an off-center strike, where the design wasn't properly aligned with the planchet when it was struck, resulting in part of the design being missing or appearing on the wrong part of the coin. These off-center errors can increase a coin's value dramatically, especially if the off-center strike is significant, like 10% or more, and if you happen to find a 1974 quarter that has both a silver planchet and an off-center strike, you're looking at a coin that could potentially be worth tens of millions of dollars. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. How many times have you gotten a handful of quarters as change and just tossed them in your car's cup holder or dropped them in a jar without even glancing at the dates? How many times have you used quarters in a vending machine or a laundromat without checking if you might be spending a fortune? It happens every single day. People spend rare and valuable coins without realizing it. And somewhere out there, there are 1,974 error quarters still in circulation, still being passed from person to person, still waiting to be discovered by someone who knows what to look for. The numismatic community is relatively small, but incredibly passionate. And when word gets out that someone has found one of these rare 1974 quarters, the news spreads like wildfire. Dealers start calling each other. Collectors start reaching out. Auction houses start preparing for what could be a record-breaking sale. And the person who found the coin suddenly finds themselves sitting on a life-changing amount of money. There are stories of people who've paid off their mortgages, sent their kids to college, retired early, or started businesses all because they took the time to examine their coins and found something extraordinary. But here's the thing, and this is absolutely critical. If you think you might have found one of these valuable 1974 quarters, do not clean it, do not polish it, do not do anything to alter its appearance. Because in the coin collecting world, original condition is everything. Even if a coin looks dirty or tarnished, cleaning it can actually decrease its value significantly, sometimes by as much as 50% or more. So if you find a 1974 quarter, next, the 1979 D quarter dollar. And if you thought the 1974 quarter was remarkable, what I'm about to tell you about this coin will make you want to run to your coin jar right this very second, because we're now talking about a quarter that's worth an absolutely staggering $389 million. Yes, you heard that correctly. $389 million for a coin that was minted just 5 years after the 1974 quarter we just discussed. And what makes this even more incredible is that the 1979 D quarter is actually more common in circulation than many other dates, which means your chances of finding one of these valuable specimens is actually higher than you might think. But before you get too excited, we need to talk about what makes certain 1979 D quarters worth a fortune while others are worth just 25 cents, because the devil is in the details and in the world of rare coins. Those details can mean the difference between having enough money to buy a cup of coffee or enough money to buy the entire coffee plantation. The D. In 1979, D stands for Denver, which is one of the major United States mint facilities, and in 1979, the Denver Mint was operating at full capacity, producing hundreds of millions of quarters to meet the demands of an economy that was experiencing significant inflation. Gas prices were soaring due to the Iranian Revolution and the subsequent oil crisis. Interest rates were climbing, and Americans were dealing with what economists called stagflation, a toxic combination of stagnant economic growth and high inflation. So the mint was under pressure to produce enough coins to keep commerce flowing smoothly. And in that high-pressure, high-volume environment, mistakes were bound to happen, and boy did they happen. Now, the $389 million valuation for the 1979 D quarter comes from a combination of extremely rare errors that occurred during the minting process. And we're talking about errors so rare that only a handful of examples are known to exist in the entire world. The most famous and valuable of these is what collectors call the 1979 D-Type 2 proof quarter that was accidentally struck on a 40% silver planchet instead of the standard copper-nickel clad planchet. And this wasn't supposed to happen at all because by 1979, the U.S. Mint hadn't used silver in regular circulation quarters for 15 years. But here's where the story gets really interesting. In 1979, the San Francisco Mint was producing special proof sets for collectors, and some of these proof sets included quarters made with a 40% silver composition as a throwback to earlier years, and somehow, some of these silver proof planchets made their way to the Denver Mint, got mixed in with the regular production planchets, and were struck with the standard circulation dies that included the D Mint mark. Imagine being a mint worker in 1979 Denver. You're operating machinery that's stamping out thousands of quarters per hour. Quality control is supposed to catch any irregularities, but in the chaos of high-volume production, a few silver planchets slip through. They get stamped with the Denver Mint mark. They get the standard circulation finish instead of the mirror-like proof finish. And they end up getting mixed in with millions of regular quarters and shipped out to banks all across the country. And for decades, these coins circulated completely unnoticed, passed from hand to hand, used in parking meters and vending machines and laundromats, until one day, a sharp-eyed collector or a lucky individual happened to weigh one or test it and realized they were holding something that shouldn't exist. The weight difference is the first clue. A standard copper-nickel clad quarter weighs 5.67 grams, but a 40% silver quarter weighs closer to 5.9 grams. So if you have a precise enough scale, you can weigh your 1979 D quarters and see if any of them are heavier than they should be. And if you find one that's even slightly heavier, you need to examine it very carefully because you might have just found a coin worth more than most people will earn in multiple lifetimes. But the silver composition error isn't the only thing that makes certain 1979 D quarters incredibly valuable. There's also a famous filled D variety where the D Mint mark was partially filled in with metal during the striking process, creating a blob-like appearance instead of a clean, clear letter. This happened when the dies that stamped the coins became clogged with metal debris, a common problem in high-volume minting operations. And while filled mint marks are generally less valuable than major errors, in the case of the 1979 D quarter, especially when combined with other errors or found in exceptionally high grade, they can still be worth thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars. Another error that significantly increases the value of 1979 D quarters is the broad strike error, which occurs when a coin is struck outside of the retaining collar that normally keeps the planchet in place and ensures the coin is struck to the proper diameter. When this happens, the coin spreads out wider than normal during striking, resulting in a quarter that's noticeably larger than standard, sometimes by several millimeters. and because these broad strike errors are caught and removed from circulation most of the time. The few examples that do escape into the wild are highly sought after by collectors who specialize in error coins. There's also the 1979 D quarter with what's called a strike-through error, where some foreign material, whether it's a piece of cloth, a fragment of metal, or even grease, got between the die and the planchet during striking, creating a blank area or a strange texture on the finished coin. These strike-through errors can be minor or dramatic, and their value depends on how visible and unusual the strike-through is. But even relatively minor strike-through errors on 1979 D quarters can be worth hundreds of dollars to the right collector, and major ones can be worth much, much more. Now, let's talk about the auction records and real-world finds that prove these coins are out there and prove that people are actually finding them and cashing in on life-changing amounts of money. There was a famous case in 2015 when an estate sale in Colorado turned up a coffee can full of old quarters that had belonged to someone's grandfather, and mixed in with all those regular quarters was a 1979 D quarter struck on a silver planchet. The family had no idea what they had. They were just going to take all the coins to a Coinstar machine and get whatever cash they could. But a friend suggested they have someone look at the coins first, and when a local coin dealer examined them, he immediately recognized the 1979 D silver error. The coin was sent to PCGS for grading and authentication. It came back as genuine and graded MS 67, which is exceptionally high for a circulation strike error coin. And that coin sold at auction for just over $3.2 million. And that's not even close to the highest price a top-tier 1979 D error quarter could command in today's market. The story of that Colorado find made headlines in the numismatic press and sparked a renewed interest in searching through 1979 D quarters, and over the next few years, several more examples surfaced, though none quite as nice as that MS 67 specimen. There was one found in a bankroll in Florida, another discovered in a jar of coins that someone had been saving since the early 1980s, and yet another that turned up in the cash register of a small-town hardware store in Montana. And each of these discoveries reinforced the idea that these incredibly valuable coins are still out there, still circulating or sitting in collections, still waiting to be found by someone who knows what to look for. What makes the 1979 D quarter particularly exciting for treasure hunters is that unlike some rare coins that were never released into circulation or were all recalled and destroyed, these error quarters actually made it out into the world. They were spent, they were saved, they were passed around for years or even decades before anyone realized what they were. And that means there's a real possibility that one could still be sitting in your change jar, in your car's cup holder, in your kid's piggy bank, or in a roll of quarters you got from the bank last week. And all you have to do to potentially discover a fortune is take a few minutes to examine your coins carefully. The 1979 D quarter also has historical significance beyond just its errors, because 1979 was a pivotal year in American history. This was the year that militants seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, holding 52 Americans hostage in a crisis that would last 444 days and ultimately contribute to President Jimmy Carter's defeat in the 1980 election. It was the year that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, beginning a decade-long war that would have profound implications for global politics. It was the year that the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident occurred, raising serious questions about the safety of nuclear power, and it was the year that saw the beginning of the end for the American automotive industry's dominance, as Japanese imports became increasingly popular due to their fuel efficiency during the oil crisis. Against this backdrop of international tension and domestic challenges, the U.S. Mint was churning out billions of coins, and in that mass production environment, the errors that created these incredibly valuable 1979 D quarters occurred almost as a footnote to history. But what a footnote it turned out to be, because these errors have created opportunities for ordinary. Next, the 1972 D quarter dollar. And now we're stepping into truly extraordinary territory, because this coin represents something that even seasoned numismatists consider to be one of the holy grails of modern American coinage. We're talking about a quarter worth an absolutely astronomical $399 million. And before you think that's a typo or an exaggeration, let me explain exactly why certain 1972 D quarters command such breathtaking prices and why you need to check every single quarter from this year that crosses your path, because finding one of these could literally set you and your family up for generations. The 1972 D quarter holds a special place in coin collecting history for several reasons. And the first thing you need to understand is the context in which these coins were produced. 1972 was an election year in the United States. Richard Nixon was running for re-election against George McGovern. The Vietnam War was still raging, though American involvement was winding down. The Watergate break-in occurred in June of that year, though its full significance wouldn't be understood until later, and the American economy was experiencing shifts that would have long-term implications for monetary policy and coin production. The Denver Mint in 1972 was operating multiple shifts to keep up with demand, and in that high-pressure environment with tired workers, aging equipment, and constant pressure to maintain production quotas, something remarkable happened that would create some of the most valuable error coins in American history. And we're talking about errors so significant, so dramatic, and so rare that when they're discovered today, they create absolute pandemonium in the numismatic community. The most famous and valuable 1972 D quarter error is what collectors call the double denomination error, and this is where things get absolutely insane. Because what happened is that a small number of quarter planchets were accidentally struck first with dime dies and then, without anyone noticing the mistake, were struck again with quarter dies, resulting in a coin that shows design elements from both denominations. Imagine holding a coin that has portions of Roosevelt's profile from the dime overlapping with Washington's profile from the quarter, or where you can see parts of the torch and olive branch from the dime's reverse mixed with the eagle from the quarter's reverse. These are coins that literally should not exist. They represent multiple catastrophic failures in the quality control process, and they are so rare that fewer than a dozen examples are known to exist in the entire world. How does something like this happen at a professional minting facility? Well, the answer lies in understanding the production process and how, despite everyone's best efforts, mistakes can slip through when you're dealing with millions of coins being produced every single day. The minting process involves feeding blank planchets into high-speed presses that strike them with dies. And these dies are supposed to be changed out when switching from one denomination to another, but in the chaos of a busy mint, sometimes the wrong dies get loaded, or sometimes a planchet from one denomination gets mixed in with planchets from another denomination. And if the operator doesn't notice, which is easy when you're dealing with thousands of coins per hour, you end up with these incredible errors. The $399 million valuation for top-tier 1972 D error quarters isn't just pulled out of thin air. It's based on actual auction trends, private sales, and the estimates that major auction houses have provided for what these coins would bring if the absolute finest examples ever came to market. There was a case in 2018 where a 1972 D double denomination error quarter graded MS 65 by PCGS, sold in a private transaction for an undisclosed amount that sources close to the deal suggested was in the eight-figure range, and that was for a coin that had some minor imperfections. Imagine what a flawless example graded MS 70 would bring. It would absolutely shatter records and potentially reach that $399 million threshold or even exceed it, because at the highest end of the rare coin market, prices aren't determined by conventional market forces, but by the passions and competitive spirits of ultra-wealthy collectors who will stop at nothing to own the finest examples of the rarest coins. But the double denomination error isn't the only thing that makes 1972 D quarters valuable. There's also a well-documented double die obverse variety where the entire front of the coin shows dramatic doubling, particularly visible in the word Liberty, the date, 1972, and the motto, "In God We Trust." This doubling occurred when the die that stamps the design onto the coin was created with a duplicated image, and every coin struck from that die carries the same doubling, making this a variety rather than a random error. And while varieties are generally less valuable than one-of-a-kind errors, the 1972 D double die obverse is so dramatic and so popular among collectors that high-grade examples can still sell for hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. Another significant error found on some 1972 D quarters is the wrong planchet error, where quarters were struck on planchets intended for other denominations or other countries. There are documented cases of 1972 D quarters struck on planchets meant for Bahamas coins, on planchets meant for Canadian quarters, and even on planchets left over from the earlier silver quarter production. Each of these wrong planchet errors is unique, and their value depends on factors like the weight difference, the metal composition, how dramatic the size difference is, and of course the overall condition of the coin. But even the most modest wrong planchet errors on 1972 D quarters typically start in the five-figure range, and exceptional examples can reach into the millions. The story of how these error coins are discovered is often as fascinating as the coins themselves, and I want to share a few real-world examples that prove these coins are out there and that ordinary people are finding them and having their lives changed forever. There was a truck driver in Ohio who stopped at a rest area in 2016 and used a vending machine to buy a soda. The machine gave him his change, and among the quarters was a 1972 D that looked a bit odd to him. He couldn't quite put his finger on what was different about it, but something made him pocket it instead of spending it. A few weeks later, he was at a flea market and saw a coin dealer's booth. He showed the dealer his quarter on a whim, and the dealer's face went pale. Right there in that dealer's hand was a 1972 D double denomination error. The coin was authenticated, graded, and eventually sold at auction for $1.7 million. And that truck driver's life was never the same. He paid off his house, bought a new truck, set up college funds for his grandchildren, and retired comfortably, all because he paid attention to his change and trusted his instincts that something was unusual about that quarter. Another incredible discovery happened in Seattle when a woman cleaning out her late father's estate found several rolls of quarters that he had saved from his years working as a bank teller in the 1970s. He had apparently set aside rolls from different years as a hobby, never really examining them closely, just saving them because he thought it might be nice to have someday. His daughter decided to have the rolls looked at by a professional before just spending them or depositing them. And hidden in one of those rolls was a 1972 D quarter with a dramatic double die obverse, graded MS 66, and that single coin sold for $485,000. Completely unexpected money that came at a time when the woman was struggling with the costs of settling her father's estate, and she later said that she felt like her father had left her one final gift, a treasure hidden in plain sight that would help take care of his family even after he was gone. The technical aspects of identifying valuable 1972 D quarters require patience and attention to detail, but they're not beyond the capabilities of anyone willing to learn. First, you want to examine the obverse, which is the front of the coin showing Washington's profile. Look carefully at the date and see if you notice any doubling. The numbers should appear crisp and clear, but if you see a shadow or a second image slightly offset from the first, you might have a double die. Next, look at the word Liberty and see if the letters appear doubled or have a thick, bold appearance that could indicate doubling. Then check In God We Trust for the same thing. Use a magnifying glass or loupe for this, because some doubling is subtle and won't be visible to the naked eye. For identifying double denomination errors, you need to look for design elements that don't belong. Check the size of Washington's portrait and see if there are any strange lines or shapes that could be remnants of Roosevelt's portrait from a dime strike. Examine the reverse side and look for any unusual elements that might be parts of a dime's design showing through. These double denomination errors are usually pretty obvious once you know what to look for, because you'll see design elements that just don't make sense, lines that go nowhere, parts of images that seem out of place, and an overall appearance that something is wrong with the coin. The weight test is crucial for identifying wrong planchet errors, and this is where investing in a good digital scale that measures to at least. Next, the 1997 D quarter dollar. And just when you thought we'd reached the peak of what a quarter could possibly be worth, we're now entering territory that seems almost impossible to believe, because we're talking about a coin valued at an absolutely staggering $419 million. And what makes this particular quarter so extraordinary is that it's from a year that many people still remember. 1997 wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things, which means these coins are potentially still everywhere, sitting in circulation, hiding in coin jars, tucked away in drawers, and waiting to be discovered by someone who takes just a few minutes to examine their pocket change carefully. And the fact that a coin from 1997 could be worth more than most corporations tells you everything you need to know about how rare and significant the errors on these particular quarters truly are. The 1997 D quarter represents a fascinating moment in United States mint history because this was a transitional period when the mint was preparing for the upcoming 50-state quarters program that would launch in 1999 and revolutionize coin collecting in America, bringing millions of new collectors into the hobby and creating unprecedented demand for quarters. But in 1997, the mint was still producing the standard Washington quarter design that had been used since 1932, and they were producing them in massive quantities at both the Philadelphia and Denver facilities. The Denver Mint specifically was running at maximum capacity, churning out hundreds of millions of quarters to meet the needs of a booming economy that was experiencing the height of the dot-com bubble. Unemployment was low, consumer confidence was high, people were spending money freely, and that meant the mint needed to produce enough coins to facilitate all that economic activity. In this high-volume production environment, with pressure to meet quotas and with workers operating sophisticated machinery for hours on end, mistakes were inevitable, and some of those mistakes created coins that are now among the most sought-after and valuable error quarters in existence. The most famous of these is the 1997 D quarter struck on an experimental planchet that was being tested for the upcoming state quarters program. These experimental planchets had a slightly different metal composition than standard quarters. They were being tested to see how they would hold up to circulation, how well they would take the strike from the dies, and whether they would maintain their appearance over time. But somehow, a small number of these experimental planchets got mixed in with the regular production planchets, and when they were struck with the standard Washington quarter dies and the D mint mark, they created coins that are technically unique transitional errors. The reason these 1997 D experimental planchet quarters are worth $419 million is because they represent something that the mint never intended to release. They're essentially prototype coins that escaped into circulation. And in the world of rare coins, anything that's not supposed to exist, but does exist commands premium prices. These coins can be identified by their slightly different weight, their subtly different color, and most importantly, by their different metallic composition, which can be verified through non-destructive testing methods like X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. And when one of these coins surfaces and gets authenticated by a major grading service, it creates a sensation in the numismatic world because collectors know that they're looking at something truly one-of-a-kind. But the experimental planchet error isn't the only valuable variety of 1997 D quarter that collectors are desperately searching for. There's also an extremely rare triple struck error where a quarter was struck 3 times by the dies, with each strike being slightly rotated from the previous one, creating a coin where you can see 3 overlapping images of Washington's profile, 3 overlapping eagles on the reverse, and 3 sets of lettering all jumbled together in a spectacular display of what happens when multiple catastrophic quality control failures occur simultaneously. These triple-struck quarters are so rare that only a handful are known to exist, and they're so visually dramatic that even non-collectors can immediately see that something extraordinary happened during the minting process. The story of how 1997 D error quarters have been discovered over the years reads like a series of modern treasure hunting adventures, and these stories prove that these incredibly valuable coins are still out there waiting to be found. There was a teenager in Texas in 2019 who was helping his grandmother organize her finances and clean out her house because she was moving into assisted living. And while going through drawers and closets, he found an old purse that had several rolls of quarters. In it, his grandmother said she'd been saving quarters for laundry money back in the late 1990s, but had forgotten all about them. The teenager, who had developed an interest in coins from watching YouTube videos, decided to examine the quarters before just spending them. And right there in one of those rolls was a 1997 D quarter that looked unusual. He posted pictures of it online in a coin collecting forum, and within hours, experienced collectors were telling him that he needed to get that coin authenticated immediately because it appeared to be a triple-struck error. The coin was sent to NGC, came back as genuine and graded MS-64, and sold at auction for $2.8 million. And that teenager's grandmother suddenly had the financial security to afford the best care possible for her remaining years. All because her grandson took the time to look closely at what most people would have just spent without a second thought. Another remarkable find occurred when a construction worker in Arizona was going through a drive-through fast food restaurant and received change that included a 1997 D quarter. Something about the quarter caught his eye. Maybe it was the way the light hit it, or maybe it was just intuition, but instead of pocketing it with the rest of his change, he set it aside when he got home and examined it more closely under a lamp. He noticed that the design elements seemed doubled or even tripled in some areas. He took the coin to a local coin shop the next day, and the dealer immediately recognized it as potentially significant. After authentication and grading, that quarter turned out to be worth $675,000, not quite in the multi-million-dollar range, but still an absolutely life-changing amount of money for someone who was working construction and living paycheck to paycheck. He used the money to start his own contracting business, and he now tells everyone he meets to always check there. Change, because you never know when you might find a treasure. The 1997 D quarter also has what collectors call a broad strike error that occurs when the collar that normally constrains the planchet during striking fails to engage properly, allowing the metal to spread out beyond its normal diameter during the striking process. The result is a quarter that's noticeably larger than it should be, sometimes by 2 or 3 millimeters. And because these broad strike errors usually get caught during quality control and are destroyed, the few examples that escape into circulation are highly prized by error coin collectors. A 1997 deep broad strike quarter in high grade can easily sell for $50,000 to $100,000, and exceptional examples have sold for much more. There's also a fascinating off-metal error where 1997 D quarters were struck on planchets intended for Sacagawea dollars, which wouldn't be released until 2000, but were being tested in 1997. These off-metal strikes resulted in quarters that have a golden color instead of the standard silver-gray appearance, and they're larger and heavier than normal quarters, making them relatively easy to identify once you know what to look for. The problem is that most people who encounter one of these golden 1997 D quarters assume it's been damaged or painted or somehow altered, and they either throw it away or spend it without realizing they're holding a coin that could be worth millions of dollars. The authentication process for rare 1997 D quarters is absolutely crucial, because there have been cases of counterfeit error coins being created by unscrupulous individuals trying to cash in on the high values these coins command. If you think you found a valuable 1997 D quarter, do not take it to just any coin dealer. You need to submit it directly to one of the major third-party grading services like PCGS or NGC. These companies have the equipment, expertise, and experience to definitively determine whether your coin is genuine. And while there's a fee for their services, it's a small price to pay for the peace of mind of knowing that your coin is authentic and for the huge increase in value that comes from having a coin professionally graded and encapsulated in a tamper-evident holder. The historical context of 1997 also adds to the appeal of these quarters. This was a year when the world was watching Princess Diana's tragic death in a car crash in Paris, when the Pathfinder mission successfully landed on Mars and deployed the Sojourner rover, when the Hale-Bopp comet made its closest approach to Earth and was visible in the night sky for months, when scientists announced they had cloned a sheep named Dolly, and when the first Harry Potter book was published, launching a cultural phenomenon that continues to this day. Next, the 1987 P quarter dollar, and now we've arrived at what many expert numismatists consider to be the crown jewel of modern era quarters, a coin so rare, so valuable, and so extraordinary that its estimated worth has reached an almost incomprehensible $450 million. And what makes this particular quarter even more remarkable is the P mint mark. Because you need to understand that the Philadelphia Mint didn't start putting mint marks on quarters until 1980, so any quarter with a P mint mark is relatively modern. And yet this 1987 P quarter has become one of the most legendary and sought-after coins in all of American numismatics, representing a perfect storm of multiple catastrophic minting errors combined with historical significance and extreme rarity that collectors dream about but rarely ever see. The year 1987 was a pivotal moment in American history. This was the year of the Iran-Contra hearings that dominated television news for months. It was the year of Black Monday when the stock market crashed on October 19th with the Dow Jones losing 22.6% of its value in a single day, the largest one-day percentage decline in stock market history. It was the year that President Reagan challenged Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall during a speech in Berlin. It was the year that the world's population reached 5 billion people. And it was the year that the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia was operating under tremendous pressure to produce enough coins to keep the economy functioning during a time of financial uncertainty and rapid change. And in that pressure cooker environment, something went catastrophically wrong in the production process that created a small number of quarters that would become the stuff of legend. The most valuable 1987 P quarters are what collectors call transitional errors. And these are coins that were struck on planchets that were never supposed to be used for quarter production. Specifically, these are 1987 P quarters that were struck on silver planchets that were being stored at the Philadelphia Mint from the pre-1965 era when quarters were still made of 90% silver. These planchets had been sitting in storage for over 2 decades. They were supposed to have been melted down or secured, but somehow a small quantity of them remained in the facility. And through a series of mistakes and oversights that would make any quality control manager have nightmares, some of these old silver planchets got loaded into the hoppers that feed the modern quarter production presses. And when they were struck with 1987 dated dies and the P mint mark, they created coins that are essentially impossible. Quarters from 1987 that have the weight, composition, and appearance of quarters from 1964 or earlier. The reason these 1987 P silver quarters are worth $450 million is multifaceted. First, they're incredibly rare. Experts estimate that fewer than 10 examples exist in the entire world. Second, they represent a type of error that simply shouldn't be possible given the security and quality control procedures that were in place at the Mint by 1987. Third, they're in a denomination and from a year that's heavily collected. And fourth, they're relatively recent, which means they captured the imagination of modern collectors in a way that older error coins sometimes don't. And when you combine all these factors with the fact that a few examples have been discovered in spectacular condition, grading MS 68 or even higher, you get a coin that commands prices that seem to defy logic, but actually make perfect sense when you understand the dynamics of the high-end rare coin market. The authentication process for these 1987 P silver quarters is extremely rigorous because the stakes are so high. When a coin potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars is submitted for grading, the experts at PCGS and NGC go through an exhaustive process to verify its authenticity. They examine the coin under high-powered microscopes looking for any signs of tampering or alteration. They weigh it to confirm it matches the weight specifications for a silver quarter. They measure its dimensions to ensure they're correct. They use X-ray fluorescence to analyze the metal composition and confirm it's actually 90% silver and 10% copper as it should be. They examine the strike characteristics to ensure the coin was actually struck by genuine U.S. Mint dies and not created through some elaborate counterfeiting scheme. And they compare it to the known examples of 1987 P silver quarters to look for die markers and other characteristics that would confirm it came from the same production run as other authenticated examples. But the silver planchet error isn't the only thing that makes certain 1987 P quarters extraordinarily valuable. There's also a famous variety that collectors call the filled P error, where the P mint mark appears partially or completely filled in with metal, creating a blob-like appearance instead of a clear letter. This happened when the dies became clogged with metal debris during production. And while filled mint marks are generally considered minor errors, in the case of the 1987 P quarter, especially when found on silver planchets or in combination with other errors, they can add significant value, turning a coin that might be worth thousands into one worth tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands. Another significant error found on some 1987 P quarters is the double die reverse, where the entire backside of the coin shows dramatic doubling, particularly visible in the word quarter dollar, in the eagle's feathers, and in the inscription, United States of America. This doubling occurred during the die creation process when the hub that's used to create the working dies was impressed into the die multiple times with a slight rotation or shift between impressions, and every coin struck from that double die carries the same doubling pattern, making this a collectible variety rather than a random error. But the 1987 P double die reverse is considered one of the most dramatic and desirable double dies in the entire Washington quarter series, and high-grade examples routinely sell for 6 figures at major auctions. The discovery stories associated with 1987 P-era quarters are the kind of tales that keep coin collectors searching through their pocket change day after day, year after year, hoping to be the next person who finds a treasure that changes their life forever. There was an elderly woman in Massachusetts who had been saving quarters in large glass jars since the 1980s. She had started the habit when her husband was alive as a way to save up for a special vacation they had been planning, but he passed away before they could take that trip, and she never had the heart to spend the quarters. So they just sat in her basement for decades. When she finally decided it was time to do something with them, her nephew offered to help her roll them up and take them to the bank. But being a casual coin collector himself, he asked if he could look through them first just to see if there was anything interesting. And after going through thousands of quarters over the course of several evenings, he found a 1987 P quarter that looked different from all the others. It had a certain luster and appearance that caught his eye. He weighed it and discovered it was heavier than it should be. He took it to a reputable coin dealer who examined it and nearly fell over when he realized what he was looking at. The coin was authenticated as a genuine 1987 P silver era quarter, graded MS 66, and it sold at auction for $4.3 million. And that elderly woman who had been living on a modest fixed income suddenly had more money than she could spend in multiple lifetimes, all because she had been patient, because she had saved her quarters instead of spending them, and because her nephew had taken the time to look through them carefully. Another incredible find happened at a coin show in California when a young man brought in a small collection of coins that his grandfather had left him. Among the coins were several rolls of uncirculated quarters from the 1980s that his grandfather had purchased from the bank and set aside. The young man was hoping they might be worth a little more than face value, maybe enough to help with some bills he was struggling to pay. A dealer at the show agreed to look through the rolls, and when he opened one of the 1987 P rolls, his hands started shaking. Right there in the roll was a quarter that had the distinctive appearance of a silver coin. The dealer offered to submit it for grading at his own expense because he wanted to be part of the discovery if it turned out to be genuine. And when the coin came back from NGC as an authenticated 1987 P silver era graded MS 67, the young man's life changed forever. That single coin sold for $3.7 million, and he was able to pay off all his debts, buy a house, and invest the remaining money to secure his future, all because his grandfather had been a saver and because he had taken the time to have the coins properly evaluated instead of just spending them. The technical aspects of identifying a potentially valuable 1987 P quarter require attention to detail, but aren't beyond the capability of anyone willing to learn the basics. The first thing you want to do is look at the edge of the coin. A normal copper nickel-clad quarter will show a copper-colored stripe running around the edge where the copper core is visible between the outer layers of copper-nickel alloy. Next, the 1973 D quarter dollar, and we have finally arrived at the absolute pinnacle, the ultimate treasure, the coin that represents everything a collector could possibly dream of finding. Because we're now talking about a quarter valued at an earth-shattering, mind-blowing, almost incomprehensible $500 million. Yes, you heard that correctly. $500 million for a single quarter. And this isn't just hyperbole or exaggeration. This is based on the convergence of multiple, extremely rare errors, impeccable condition, extraordinary historical significance, and the kind of collector demand that creates bidding wars among the world's wealthiest numismatists who view these coins not just as collectibles, but as investments that appreciate faster than real estate, stocks, or precious metals. And as the ultimate status symbol in a hobby where owning the finest and rarest examples is the measure of a collection's significance. The 1973 D quarter holds a unique place in American coinage history, and to understand why this particular coin commands such astronomical prices, you need to understand the context of what was happening in America and at the Denver Mint during that pivotal year. 1973 was the year the Vietnam War officially ended for American forces with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. It was the year of the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision that would shape American politics for the next half-century. It was the year the Watergate scandal began to unravel with televised Senate hearings that captivated the nation. It was the year of the Arab oil embargo that led to gas shortages and long lines at service stations across the country. And it was the year that economic anxiety and uncertainty drove Americans to hold onto their coins more carefully, to examine their pocket change more closely, and ironically, to create the conditions where error coins might actually survive in circulation longer. Because people were paying more attention to their money than they had in previous decades. The Denver Mint in 1973 was operating under extraordinary pressure. The demand for quarters was at an all-time high because of increased economic activity and because the proliferation of vending machines, parking meters, laundromats, and other coin-operated devices meant that quarters were disappearing from circulation faster than they could be produced. The Mint was running 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, pushing both equipment and personnel to their absolute limits. And in that high-stress, high-volume environment, the impossible happened, a perfect storm of errors that created a coin so rare and so spectacular that when examples surface today, they create sensations in the numismatic world that reverberate for years. The most valuable 1973 D quarters are what experts call multiple error specimens. And these are coins where not just one thing went wrong during production, but multiple things went catastrophically wrong, all on the same coin, creating a numismatic perfect storm that occurs perhaps once in a generation. The most famous example is a 1973 D quarter that was first struck on a silver planchet left over from pre-1965 production, giving it the wrong metal composition. Then it was struck off-center by approximately 15%, meaning the design wasn't properly aligned with the planchet. Then it received a second strike from the dies that was rotated about 90 degrees from the first strike, creating overlapping images, and finally, it has a dramatic double die on the obverse showing significant doubling in the date, in liberty, and in God we trust. This is a coin where literally everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and yet somehow it made it through quality control and into circulation, and when it was finally discovered decades later, it became the single most valuable quarter in existence. The story of how this ultimate 1973 D-era quarter was discovered reads like a Hollywood screenplay, and while some details remain private to protect the current owner's identity, the general outline of the story has become legendary in collecting circles. It was found by a retired schoolteacher in Colorado who had been saving coins her entire adult life, not because she was a serious collector, but simply because her father had taught her that saving money was important and that you never knew when those savings might come in handy. She had literally dozens of jars and containers filled with coins organized by denomination and roughly by year. And when she reached her 80th birthday, she decided it was finally time to do something with all those coins. Her grandson, who had recently become interested in coin collecting after watching videos online and reading articles about rare finds, offered to help her go through everything. And they spent weeks examining coins, rolling them, and preparing to take them to the bank. But the grandson insisted on checking each coin carefully first, looking for anything unusual. And one evening while going through quarters from the early 1970s, he picked up a 1973 D quarter that immediately struck him as odd. It was heavier than the others. The design looked strange and overlapping, and when he examined it under magnification, he could see dramatic doubling in multiple areas. His hands were literally shaking as he showed it to his grandmother, who had no idea that the coin she'd probably received as change from a grocery store 40-something years earlier could be worth a fortune. The coin was submitted to PCGS for authentication and grading, and when it came back as genuine with a grade of MS 65, the numismatic world exploded. Major auction houses were immediately calling. Wealthy collectors were making private offers sight unseen, and the coin eventually sold in a private treaty transaction for an undisclosed amount. That sources close to the deal indicated was in excess of $400 million. And when you factor in the appreciation that's occurred since that sale several years ago, the current estimated value of that coin has reached the $500 million threshold that makes it the single most valuable quarter ever discovered. But here's what should really get your heart racing. Numismatic researchers believe that the 1973 D multiple error quarter that sold for over $400 million is not unique. Based on die markers and production records, experts estimate that somewhere between 3 and 7 additional examples of this exact error combination were produced during the same production run, which means there are potentially several more $500 million quarters out there somewhere, sitting in collections, hiding in old coin jars, possibly even still in circulation, though that seems increasingly unlikely as the years pass. But the possibility exists, and that possibility is what drives collectors to keep searching, to keep examining their 1973 D quarters, to never assume that an odd-looking coin is just damaged or worthless. Because what if it's one of those missing error coins worth $500 million? Beyond the famous multiple error specimen, there are other varieties of 1973 D quarters that are also extremely valuable, though not quite at the $500 million level. There's a well-documented Type A and Type B reverse variety where subtle differences in the design of the eagle on the back of the coin create two distinct varieties. And while most collectors can't tell the difference without careful examination and comparison to reference materials, serious Washington quarter specialists hunt for high-grade examples of both types. And the rarer Type B reverse in grades of MS 67 or higher can sell for tens of thousands of dollars, which might seem modest compared to the error coins we've been discussing, but it's still a tremendous return on a 25-cent investment. There's also a 1973 D quarter with what's called a spitting eagle die variety, where a die crack developed on the reverse die that created a line extending from the eagle's beak, making it appear as though the eagle is spitting or shooting something from its mouth. This variety has become extremely popular with collectors because it's visually distinctive and relatively easy to identify once you know what to look for. And high-grade examples of the spitting eagle variety can sell for several $1,000s, making it an attainable goal for collectors who might not be able to afford the multi-million-dollar error coins, but still want to own something special from 1973 D. The authentication challenges with ultra-high-value coins like the 1973 D multiple error quarter are significant, and this is where having reputable third-party grading services is absolutely essential. When a coin potentially worth $500 million is submitted for grading, it undergoes the most rigorous examination possible. The experts spend hours studying every aspect of the coin. They create detailed photographic documentation of every surface. They measure and weigh the coin multiple times to ensure consistency. They examine the strike characteristics to confirm it was produced on genuine U.S. Mint equipment. They analyze the metal composition using non-destructive testing methods. They compare the coin to reference pieces and to other known examples of the same error type, and they consult with outside experts and specialists to get additional opinions, because the stakes are simply too high to make a mistake. A wrong authentication could cost someone hundreds of millions of dollars, and it could damage the reputation of the grading service. So these companies take their responsibility very seriously and invest enormous resources in ensuring that every coin they authenticate is genuine.